In the winter of 1215, a peasant family in the English village of Elton woke before dawn in a one-room house with no chimney, no glass, and no certainty that the grain they had stored would last until spring. Their survival depended on decisions made by men they would never meet, weather they could not predict, and a social order that bound them to the land from birth to death. This exploration follows the lived reality of medieval peasant life in 13th and 14th century England and France, reconstructing the daily labor, the structure of hunger, the weight of obligation, and the fragile systems that held rural society together. The focus rests on the decades between 1200 and 1350 of the Common Era, a period when manorial records, court rolls, and account books began to accumulate in sufficient detail to allow historians a glimpse into lives that left almost no narrative of their own. The peasant made up more than 90% of the population of medieval Europe, yet their world remains among the least understood, buried beneath centuries of romanticism, misrepresentation, and silence. The village of Elton in Huntingdonshire offers one such glimpse. In the early 14th century, Elton was home to roughly 400 people, most of them tenants of the Abbey of Ramsey. The abbey kept meticulous records. Those records show that a typical villein household held between 15 and 30 acres scattered across the open fields, paid rent in kind and in cash, owed labour services to the Lord 2 or 3 days each week, and attended the manor court every 3 weeks to settle disputes, witness transactions, and answer for breaches of custom. The records also show that in the winter of 1215, the harvest had failed. Grain prices doubled, then tripled. Livestock starved. People began to die. The famine that followed, stretching into 1216 and beyond, killed more than 10% of the rural population in some regions. It was not the first famine England had seen, and it would not be the last, but it serves as a reminder that the medieval peasant lived always on the edge of catastrophe, sustained by systems that worked only when the weather cooperated. The Lord was not too rapacious, and the grain held out until the next harvest. To understand that precariousness requires understanding the manor itself. The manor was not simply an estate, it was the organizing structure of rural life, the framework within which land, labor, lordship, and custom intersected. A manor consisted of the lord's demesne, the land he farmed directly using the labor of his tenants, and the tenant holdings, the strips of arable land scattered across the open fields that peasants worked for their own subsistence. Beyond the fields lay common pasture, where villagers grazed livestock, woodland, jealously guarded and regulated, and the mill, the oven, sometimes a brewery, all of which the lord controlled and for which he charged fees. The manor house stood at the centre, often modest, sometimes fortified, always a reminder of who held power. The peasant family's survival depended on access to land, but that access was never guaranteed and never free. It came with obligations that could not be refused. Those obligations took many forms. A villein, the most common type of peasant tenant, owed week work, typically 2 or 3 days of labour each week on the lord's demesne. During harvest, the obligation increased. Boon work, the additional days required at the busiest and most critical time of the agricultural year, could double or triple the labour owed. The peasant also owed carrying services, transporting grain or goods to market or to the lord's other estates. Rents were paid in kind, in bushels of wheat or barley, or increasingly by the late 13th century in cash, though inflation and the commutation of services did not always work in the peasant's favour. On top of these obligations came the tithe, 1/10 of everything the peasant produced, owed to the parish church. Tithes were collected in kind, measured and carted away under the supervision of the priest or his representative. The church was as vigilant as the lord in extracting what it claimed. The enforcement of these obligations fell to the reeve and the bailiff. The reeve was typically a peasant himself, elected or appointed from among the tenants to manage the day-to-day work of the manor. The bailiff, appointed by the lord, oversaw the reeve and reported back to the lord or his steward. Between them, they ensured that labour was performed, rents were collected, and breaches of custom were noted and brought before the manor court. The court met every 3 weeks in the hall of the manor house or under a tree in the village. It was there that disputes over land boundaries, unpaid debts, trespassing livestock, and personal insults were heard and judged. It was there that the lord's rights were defended and the customs of the manor interpreted. Resistance, when it occurred, was rarely open rebellion. It took the form of delay, evasion, and negotiation, testing the limits of what the lord would tolerate without provoking punishment. The material world the peasant inhabited was one of scarcity and constant labor. The house was small, typically a single room with walls of wattle and daub, a thatched roof, and an earthen floor. There was no chimney. Smoke from the central hearth drifted upward and escaped through gaps in the thatch or a simple hole in the roof. There was no glass in the windows, only wooden shutters that could be closed against the cold and opened to admit light. The interior was dark, smoky, and shared. The family slept on straw mattresses laid on the floor. Animals, a pig or a few chickens, might share the space in winter. Tools, stored grain, and what little furniture the family owned occupied the rest of the room. Privacy did not exist. Comfort was not expected. The diet was monotonous and grain-based. Bread, pottage, and porridge made from rye, barley, and oats formed the foundation of nearly every meal. Meat was a rarity, reserved for feast days or the occasional slaughter of an aging hen. Dairy, where a family kept a cow or a few goats, provided milk, cheese, and butter, though these were luxuries not all could afford. Vegetables from a small garden plot, onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, supplemented the grain. Ale brewed weekly by the women of the household and sold under regulation by the manor's ale tasters was safer than water and consumed daily by adults and children alike. But even this diet, modest as it was, depended on a successful harvest. In years when the harvest failed, hunger arrived long before spring. The grain ran out. The vegetables were gone. Families ate what they could forage, sold what they could spare, and prayed. The famine of 1215 to 1216 showed how quickly subsistence could collapse into starvation. The world beyond the village was vast, but the peasant rarely saw it. Most lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The manor court, the parish church, the market town a day's walk away, these were the boundaries of the known world. News arrived slowly, carried by travelling merchants, wandering friars, or the occasional royal messenger passing through. The peasant knew the king existed, knew the pope existed, but their authority was abstract and distant. What mattered was the lord, the reeve, the priest, and the neighbours whose cooperation and goodwill were essential to survival. The village was a face-to-face society, where reputation could not be rebuilt and debts were not forgotten. Every action was observed, every misstep was remembered, and yet, within these constraints, life continued. Fields were ploughed, grain was sown, children were born, the manor court met, the church bell rang. The rhythms of the agricultural year, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land, provided structure and continuity even in the face of hardship. The peasant world was not static. It was a world of negotiation, adaptation, and quiet resilience, shaped by systems that were neither fair nor gentle, but that nonetheless held together until the crises of the 14th century shattered them. What follows is a reconstruction of that world, built from the fragments that survive manorial account rolls, court records, tithe lists, archaeological evidence, and the rare illuminated manuscripts that depicted rural labour. It begins with the land itself and the labour it demanded in every season. The manor was not a place. It was a system. It ordered the landscape, assigned labour, settled disputes, and determined who could marry, who could leave, and who would inherit a strip of ploughed earth after their father died. By the 13th century, the manorial system had become the organising structure of rural life across much of lowland England and northern France. It bound peasants to the land, and the land to a lord, creating a web of obligations that governed nearly every aspect of survival. The manor was where custom became law, where labour became rent, and where freedom for most was a legal fiction. At the centre stood the lord. He might be a baron, a bishop, an abbot, or the king himself, holding the manor through a grant of land tied to military or ecclesiastical service. The lord rarely lived on a single manor. A great estate might include dozens of manors scattered across several counties, each managed by a steward or bailiff who answered to the lord's household. What mattered was not the lord's presence but his authority. He held the right to extract labor, collect rents, and administer justice. He controlled access to resources that peasants could not do without: the mill where grain was ground, the oven where bread was baked, the woods where timber and fuel were gathered. The peasant did not own these things. They used them under terms set by the lord and enforced by his officers. The land itself was divided with precision. The demesnes was the portion reserved for the lord's direct exploitation, farmed by peasant labor and overseen by the reeve and bailiff. Its harvest filled the lord's barns and fed his household. The tenant land was held by peasant families under customary tenure, passed down through generations but never fully owned. A villein, the most common category of peasant, held between 15 and 30 acres scattered across the open fields. These strips were not contiguous. A single family's holding might be spread across dozens of narrow plots, intermixed with the strips of neighbors, a pattern that reflected the communal nature of ploughing and the need to distribute good and poor soil evenly. The arrangement made private farming impossible. Cooperation was not a choice. It was a condition of survival. Tenure determined status, and status determined obligation. Villeins were unfree. They could not leave the manor without permission. They could not sell their land. When a villein died, the lord collected a harriet, typically the best ox or cow the family owned, as a fee for allowing the heir to inherit the holding. Villeins owed labor services to the demesne, 2 or 3 days of work each week, plus additional boon work at peak seasons such as ploughing and harvest. These services were not negotiable. They were written into the custumal, the record of manorial custom that governed the relationship between lord and tenant. A villein who refused to plough or failed to appear for harvest work could be fined, his goods distrained, his reputation ruined in the manor court. Cottars held smaller parcels, often 5 acres or less, and their obligations reflected their marginal position. They worked as day labourers on the demesne or for wealthier peasants, supplementing their income with wage work, gleaning, and the cultivation of garden plots. Freeholders occupied a different legal world. They paid rent in cash or kind but owed no labour services. They could sell their land, leave the manor, and appeal to royal courts rather than the manor court. Yet even freeholders were bound to the manor through the obligation to grind grain at the lord's mill and bake bread in the lord's oven, monopolies that extracted fees in the form of a portion of the flour or loaves. Freedom was relative. No one escaped the lord's reach entirely. The physical layout of the manor reflected this hierarchy. The manor house stood apart, often built of stone or timber with a tiled roof, surrounded by a walled courtyard, barns, stables, and a dovecote that provided fresh meat for the lord's table. Peasant houses clustered along a single street or around a green, the thatched roofs and wattle walls marking them as structures built for function, not permanence. Beyond the village lay the open fields, vast expanses of ploughed strips that stretched toward the horizon, divided by narrow paths and low ridges of unploughed earth. The common pasture provided grazing for livestock after the harvest was brought in. The woods, carefully managed, supplied fuel, timber for building and tools, and forage for pigs. Access to these resources was regulated by custom and jealously guarded. A peasant who cut wood without permission or allowed pigs to root in the demesne faced fines that could consume weeks of labour. The mill and the oven were instruments of control as much as convenience. Peasants were required to use them, and the fees were not small. The miller took a portion of every measure of grain he ground, a toll that peasants suspected was larger than custom allowed. Accusations of theft and false measure filled the records of manor courts, but the peasant had little recourse. The mill was a monopoly, and refusal to use it meant a fine and the confiscation of hand mills, which some families kept hidden despite the risk. The oven worked the same way. Baking at home was forbidden, and those caught faced penalties that reinforced the lord's control over even the most basic acts of subsistence. The manor court met every 3 weeks, usually in the hall of the manor house or under an oak tree in the village green. It was the arena where custom was interpreted, disputes were settled, and discipline was administered. The court was presided over by the steward, but its jurors were peasants themselves. men chosen from among the more prosperous tenants to declare what custom demanded in each case. They judged land disputes, debt, trespass, theft, slander, and breaches of labor obligations. They set fines for letting animals stray into the Lord's grain, for selling ale without a license, for failing to maintain hedges or ditches. The court enforced the assize of bread and ale, regulations that fixed prices and punished brewers and bakers who sold short measure or weak drink. Women appeared frequently, usually as brewers accused of violating these standards, but also as plaintiffs and defendants in cases involving debt, defamation, and property. The manor court was not interested in justice in any abstract sense. It existed to preserve order, extract revenue, and enforce the obligations that held the system together. Fines were a source of income for the lord, and the court generated them in abundance. A villain who failed to attend court was fined. A villain who married his daughter without the lord's permission paid merchet, a fee that acknowledged the lord's claim over his tenant's reproductive choices. A villain who sent his son to school, hoping the boy might escape into the clergy, required a license and paid for the privilege. Every transaction, every change of status, every deviation from routine generated a fee that flowed upward to the lord. Yet the court was also a forum where peasants pressed their own claims. They sued each other for debt, for boundary disputes, for insults that damaged reputation. They used the court to enforce agreements, recover stolen goods, and compel neighbors to fulfill obligations. The court records reveal a society intensely litigious, where even small grievances were pursued with determination. Peasants understood the system well enough to manipulate it when they could, delaying payments, challenging the reeve's accounting, and testing the boundaries of custom. The court was a weapon, and both lord and peasant wielded it. Survival within this system required more than hard work. It required land, and land was never guaranteed. Inheritance followed local custom, which varied across regions. In some manors, the eldest son inherited the holding. In others, the youngest took it, or the land was divided among all sons. Daughters rarely inherited, unless no male heirs survived. A widow might hold her husband's land for her lifetime, but she owed the same services he had owed, and if she could not perform them, she had to hire labor or remarry quickly. The death of the head of household triggered a heriot, and if the family could not pay, the holding reverted to the lord. Landlessness was the great fear. A family without land had no claim to common pasture, no strips to plant, no standing in the community. They became laborers dependent on wages that were uncertain and inadequate, drifting toward towns or other manors in search of work. The lord's tolerance mattered as much as the letter of custom. A reeve who overlooked a missed day of labor, a steward who accepted a reduced hariot, a bailiff who did not press too hard for arrears. These small mercies could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Peasants cultivated relationships with manorial officers, offering gifts, performing favors, and navigating the informal economy of goodwill that ran alongside the formal structure of obligation. They also resisted. They delayed. They claimed ignorance. They argued that custom allowed what the lord now forbade. Outright rebellion was rare, but the steady friction of everyday resistance shaped how the manor functioned in practice. Understanding the manor means understanding the rhythm of work that structured the peasant year, beginning with the fields themselves and the labor they demanded in every season. The survival of a medieval peasant household rested not on any single harvest, but on the repeating rhythm of tasks distributed across the entire year. Each season brought its own demands, its own vulnerabilities, and its own calculus of effort and reward. The work was never finished. It merely shifted form as the months turned, governed by weather, custom, and the iron requirements of the open field system that organized nearly all arable farming across lowland England by the 13th century. The open fields lay divided into three great sections, each comprising hundreds of narrow strips held by different families and rotated annually through a fixed sequence. One field grew winter grain, wheat, or rye sown in autumn and harvested the following summer. Another held spring crops, barley, oats, peas, or beans planted after the last frost and reaped before autumn returned. The third field lay fallow, resting under stubble and weeds, grazed by village livestock whose manure would restore a fraction of the nutrients extracted by prior harvests. Every strip a family farmed would shift through this cycle, so that no single household could avoid the fallow year or monopolize the best land. The system enforced a grim equality. Everyone planted the same crops at the same time, and everyone bore the same risk when the rains failed or the frosts came early. Ploughing began the cycle, and ploughing required oxen. A full plough team needed 8 oxen to break the heavy clay soils common across the Midlands and East Anglia, and few peasant families owned more than 1 or 2 animals. Cooperation was not optional. Households pooled their beasts, forming teams that worked each family's strips in turn, according to agreements renewed every autumn and recorded, when disputes arose, in the manor court. The animals themselves represented an enormous investment. An ox cost roughly the equivalent of 2 years' cash income for a middling villein, and feeding it through winter required hay and grain that might otherwise sustain children. If an ox died or went lame, the family faced ruin unless a neighbour or the lord could be persuaded to lend a replacement. The plough itself was a cumbersome assembly of wood and iron, heavy enough to cut through matted sod and turn the furrow, light enough that a man could lift and guide it through the long day's work. Iron ploughshares wore down and required the services of the village smith, who charged in coin or kind and kept records the bailiff reviewed. Ploughing the winter field began in late September. As soon as the previous crop had been cleared and the stubble grazed down, the soil needed to be turned before the ground froze, and the work could not wait for perfect weather. Rain turned fields to sucking mud that exhausted animals and men alike. Dry spells hardened the earth until the ploughshare skipped and skittered rather than bit. The furrows ran long and straight where the land allowed, but the strips themselves were rarely uniform. Some lay on slopes, others in hollows prone to waterlogging. Boundaries between strips were marked by unploughed balks, narrow ridges of turf that provided pathways and prevented one family's furrow from encroaching on another's. Arguments over balk widths and plough angles filled the manor court rolls with tedious regularity. By late October, the winter grain went into the ground, broadcast by hand from sacks slung across the sower's chest. The seed was never enough. A poor family might sow thin, gambling that favourable weather would compensate. A wealthier one could afford to sow heavy and accept some waste to birds and rot. Once sown, the field was harrowed to cover the seed, then left to germinate under prayers and the indifferent sky. Spring brought a second round of ploughing for the spring field, lighter work on soil already broken the prior year, but no less urgent. Oats and barley had shorter growing seasons than wheat, and a late start meant a thin harvest. Peas and beans offered protein and fixed nitrogen in the soil, though medieval farmers understood the benefit through experience rather than chemistry. The spring sowing stretched from March into early May, depending on the weather and the speed with which the communal plough teams could complete their circuits. Every delay increased the risk that summer heat would stunt the crop before it matured. Between sowing and harvest lay months of vulnerable growth. Weeds colonized the fields, competing for moisture and light. Weeding was the task of women and children, who moved through the strips on hands and knees, pulling and cutting with small blades. The labour was endless. Thistles, nettles and wild grasses returned as fast as they were cleared. Birds descended in flocks and boys were stationed with slings and shouts to drive them off. Livestock broke through fences and trampled young plants, triggering disputes that could simmer for years. Hail could flatten entire fields in minutes. Prolonged rain bred fungal blights that turned grain black and inedible. Drought stunted growth and reduced yields by half. The peasant farmer had no control over any of it, only the obligation to keep working, and the faint hope that this year might be better than the last. Haymaking began in late June, when the meadows along streams and in low-lying commons reached their peak growth. Hay was not food for humans, but it was survival for the oxen and cows that made arable farming possible. Without hay, draft animals starved through winter, and without draft animals, the fields could not be ploughed. The work required speed. Grass had to be cut, turned, dried, and carted before rain soaked it and turned it to rotting mulch. Every able body in the village joined the effort, including those who owed labor services to the Lord. Scythes swung in long arcs, mowing in rhythmic lines. Women and children followed with wooden rakes, spreading the cut grass to dry in the sun. When the hay was judged ready, it was loaded onto carts and hauled to barns, or stacked in ricks thatched against the weather. The work was hot, exhausting, and unforgiving. A sudden storm could undo days of effort. A misjudgment about dryness could result in moldy hay that horses and oxen refused to eat. The margin for error was narrow, and the consequences were counted in dead animals and failed spring ploughing. Harvest arrived in late July for barley, August for wheat and rye, and early September for oats. This was the crisis point of the entire year. Everything depended on speed. Grain left standing too long, shattered from the stalk and was lost. Grain cut too early lacked full weight and spoiled in storage. Rain after cutting could soak the sheaves and trigger sprouting or rot, rendering months of labor worthless. The Lord's domains was harvested first, using the compulsory boon work owed by every tenant household. Entire villages turned out, working dawn to dusk with sickles and scythes, cutting and binding sheaves, stacking them in shocks to dry. The work was brutal, backs bent for hours under the sun, hands blistered and bled from rough straw and sharp blades, dust choked throats and filled eyes. The Lord provided ale and bread to sustain the workers, a gesture of obligation that was also calculated necessity. After the domain's fields were cleared, families could turn to their own strips, but by then the weather might have turned, or the calendar might have run short. Some years, peasants harvested their own grain in rain and gathering darkness, knowing that every sheaf they failed to save was a meal lost in the winter ahead. Threshing followed harvest, the slow and tedious work of separating grain from straw by beating sheaves with flails on a barn floor. The grain was winnowed by tossing it in the wind to blow away the chaff, then stored in sacks or bins. Some grain went immediately to the Lord as rent. More went to the church as tithe. What remained had to feed the household until the next harvest, with a portion held back for seed. The calculations were ruthless. A family might know by October that their stores would not last, that hunger would arrive in March or April, and that survival would require borrowing grain at extortionate terms, or selling labor for food when labor was least valuable. Once the grain was cut and carted, the question became not only how much had been harvested, but who controlled it, who taxed it, and what remained for the family that had grown it. Once the grain was cut and carted, the question became not only how much had been harvested, but who controlled it, who taxed it, and what remained for the family that had grown it. The harvest belonged, in theory, to the land. In practice, it belonged to a web of obligations so dense and so deeply embedded in custom that a peasant might surrender half of what they had grown before a single loaf reached their own table. The Lord took his share. The church took its tenth. The king's officers might arrive to claim taxes owed in coin or kind. What remained had to feed a family through winter, provide seed for spring planting, and cover the cost of tools, repairs, and the endless small payments that accumulated across the year. The medieval peasant did not simply work the land. They worked to satisfy a system of extraction that defined their place in the world from birth. Labor services formed the backbone of this system, and they varied widely depending on the peasant's legal status and the custom of the manor. A villein, bound to the land and subject to the Lord's will, might owe 2 or 3 days of work each week on the demesne, the portion of the manor reserved for the Lord's direct profit. This was called week work, and it was not optional. The days were specified by custom, recorded in the manor's rolls, and enforced by the Lord's officers. A villein might plough the Lord's fields in spring, weed his grain in summer, and cart his hay in June, all while their own strips waited for attention. The work was unpaid. It was considered rent for the land the villein held, a payment made in sweat rather than silver. Boon work added to the burden during the most critical seasons. At harvest, the Lord could summon his tenants for additional days of labor, often with little notice and no compensation beyond a meal. These boon days were framed as requests, a Lord asking a favor of his people, but refusal was unthinkable. The entire village might be called to the demesne to cut and bind wheat or barley, racing against weather that could ruin a crop in an afternoon. The irony was not lost on anyone. A peasant who owed boon work at harvest might watch their own grain rot in the field while they gathered the Lord's. Custom dictated the terms, but custom also bent under pressure, and manorial records from the 13th century show frequent disputes over how many days were owed, what constituted a meal, and whether certain tenants had been unfairly burdened. Carrying services rounded out the labor obligations. Tenants might be required to transport goods for the lord, hauling grain to market, wood to the manor house, or messages to neighboring estates. These tasks pulled peasants away from their own work for days at a time, and they bore the cost of feeding their own oxen or horses during the journey. A villein with no draft animal might be required to carry loads on their back or in a hand cart, trudging along muddy roads to fulfill a duty that benefited only the lord. The system assumed infinite peasant labor, as though the hours spent in service cost nothing and produced no friction. Not all peasants owed the same services. Freeholders, a minority in most villages, paid rent in cash or kind, but owed little or no labor. Their obligations were lighter, their mobility greater, and their status visibly higher. Cotters, who held only a few acres and a small house, might owe fewer days of work than villeins, but had less land to sustain them, forcing them to hire themselves out as laborers to wealthier neighbors. The variation created resentment. Two families farming beside each other in the open fields might live under entirely different rules, one bound to the lord by ancient custom, the other free to sell their labor or leave the manor entirely. Custom could be cruel, but it could also be arbitrary. Rents added another layer. Even tenants who owed labor services often paid rent as well, a double extraction that manorial lords justified by pointing to tradition. Rents in kind were common in the 13th century. A tenant might owe several bushels of grain each year, a number of hens at Christmas, or a portion of honey if they kept bees. These payments were delivered to the manor house or the lord's granary, tallied by the reeve, and recorded in the annual accounts. The church collected similarly. Each household owed 1/10 of their produce as tithe, a requirement rooted in biblical commandment and enforced by the threat of excommunication. Tithes were paid in sheaves of grain, in lambs, in fleeces, in whatever the land had yielded. The parish priest, or more often the distant monastery or bishop who controlled the parish, took the tithe and left the peasant to calculate what remained. By the late 13th century, some lords began commuting labor services to cash rents, a shift driven by economic changes and the growing availability of hired labor. A peasant who once owed 3 days of work per week might instead pay several shillings annually, a sum agreed upon and recorded in the manor court. Commutation freed the peasant from the unpredictability of boon work and allowed them to manage their own time. It also exposed them to inflation. As prices rose across the 13th and early 14th centuries, the value of fixed cash rents declined for the lord, but grew heavier for tenants, who had to sell grain or labor to raise the coin. The shift was uneven. Some manors clung to labor services well into the 14th century. Others moved almost entirely to cash. The result was a patchwork system, where neighboring villages operated under incompatible rules. Enforcement fell to the reeve and the bailiff, two figures who occupied the uncomfortable middle ground between lord and peasant. The reeve was typically a villein himself, elected or appointed by the community, but serving the lord's interests. He organized labor teams, kept track of services owed, and reported failures to the bailiff, or directly to the lord. The position brought no salary, only exemption from some labor duties, and the resentment of neighbors who saw the reeve as a collaborator. The bailiff, often a freeman hired by the lord, oversaw multiple manors and ensured that rents and services were collected on schedule. He toured the estates, inspected the work, disciplined the reeve when yields fell short, and appeared at the manor court to present charges against tenants who had shirked their duties. Both men walked a narrow line. Push too hard, and the village might resist collectively. Push too softly, and the lord might dismiss them. Resistance took forms that stopped short of rebellion, but tested the boundaries of obligation. Peasants delayed services, claiming illness or poor weather. They delivered grain that was damp or mixed with chaff, forcing the lord's agents to argue over quality. They grazed their animals on the demesne before the appointed day, a minor act of theft disguised as accident. They challenged the reeve's records in the manor court, insisting that fewer days were owed or that boon work had already been satisfied. These were not gestures of revolution, but negotiations conducted within the framework of custom. The manor court records preserve hundreds of such disputes, each one a small assertion of autonomy in a system designed to leave none. The tithe generated its own resentments. The requirement to surrender 1/10 of everything the land produced felt especially bitter when the parish priest lived comfortably while his parishioners went hungry. Worse still, many tithes went not to the local church, but to distant monasteries or bishops, who contributed nothing to the village and rarely visited. Peasants hid portions of their harvest, underreported yields, or argued over whether certain crops were subject to tithe at all. The church responded with threats of spiritual punishment, but enforcement was inconsistent. A priest who depended on his parishioners for goodwill might overlook a shortfall. An absentee rector who collected tithes through an agent might pursue every missing sheaf with legal action. The cumulative weight of these obligations meant that a substantial portion of peasant labor and production flowed upward, supporting a class of lords, clergy, and officials who performed little agricultural work themselves. The system was justified by appeals to divine order, social necessity, and immemorial custom, but it rested ultimately on the threat of punishment and the peasants' lack of alternatives. A villain who refused labor services could be fined, imprisoned, or evicted. A tenant who withheld rent faced the same. The manor court enforced these rules, and the church reinforced them with sermons on obedience and the natural hierarchy ordained by God. Yet the system required constant maintenance. Custom had to be defended, records had to be kept, and every harvest brought new disputes that required adjudication. The medieval manor was not a static structure, but a negotiated reality, reshaped slightly each season by the push and pull of obligation and evasion. Beyond the obligations owed to others, the peasant household faced the daily challenge of feeding itself on what remained. Beyond the obligations owed to others, the peasant household faced the daily challenge of feeding itself on what remained. The question was never whether there would be enough, but whether what could be grown, stored, and stretched would last until the next harvest. A family holding 20 acres under customary tenure might produce 10 or 12 quarters of grain in a good year, but once the Lord had taken his portion, the church, its tithe, and seed had been set aside for the next planting. What remained determined whether the household would eat bread or go hungry. The margin was never wide. In most years it was barely visible at all. Grain formed the foundation of existence. Rye, barley, and oats were the crops that thrived in the damp soils and cool summers of northern Europe, and they appeared on the table in every possible form. Bread was baked when fuel and flour allowed, dense and dark, often mixed with peas or beans when the grain ran low. Rye bread kept longer than wheat, though it was coarser and prone to contamination by ergot, a fungus that caused convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. Barley went into flat cakes or porridge. Oats, considered fit mainly for animals in wealthier regions, sustained many northern households through the winter as a thick greyish pottage cooked over the hearth fire in an iron pot that might be the most valuable object the family owned. The pot never truly emptied. Each day water and whatever could be added went in, and the mixture thickened or thinned depending on what the season and the stores allowed. Pottage was not a recipe, it was a strategy. Vegetables came from the garden plot that adjoined the house, a patch of land exempt from the collective rhythms of the open fields, and worked primarily by women and children. Onions and leeks grew in nearly every peasant garden, along with cabbages, peas, and beans. These crops required less space than grain and could be harvested over a longer period, providing something green when the stored grain began to taste of mold and desperation. Beans were especially valued. They could be dried and stored through the winter, added to bread dough to extend the flour, or boiled into the daily pottage. Peas served the same function. Both were filling, though neither was especially nourishing by itself. A family fortunate enough to keep a pig might slaughter it in the autumn, salting the meat for use through the cold months. Pork appeared in the pot on feast days or during the hardest labor of the harvest, when something more than grain and water was needed to sustain men working from dawn until the light failed. The rest of the pig was salted, smoked, or rendered into fat that could be spread on bread or stirred into pottage for taste and warmth. Meat was scarce, and its absence was felt. Chickens were kept for their eggs more than their flesh, and a hen that stopped laying might end up in the pot, though not without calculation. Eggs represented protein that did not require slaughter, and a household with 3 or 4 hens could expect a few eggs each week during the productive months. Dairy products were more common in regions where cows or goats could be kept, but this required access to pasture and fodder, resources that were not equally distributed. A family with a cow had milk, cheese, and butter, which made survival more bearable and malnutrition less likely. Those without made do with what the garden and the grain could provide. Cheese travelled better than milk and lasted longer, and it could be sold or traded when cash was needed for rent or fees. Butter, when it could be had, was eaten sparingly or saved for holy days. It was not a daily luxury but a marker of relative security. Ale was brewed in nearly every household, and its consumption was constant. Water from wells, streams, and ponds carried illness more often than not, and ale, even weak ale, was safer. The brewing process, which involved boiling the water and fermenting the grain, killed much of what made water dangerous. Women brewed in large wooden vats or pottery vessels, using barley or oats and whatever herbs were at hand to flavour the mixture before hops became standard in later centuries. The ale was drunk within a few days before it soured. It was not strong, but it was nutritious, providing calories and some relief from the monotony of bread and pottage. Brewing was skilled work, and women who brewed well and consistently could sell the surplus at the manor court under the regulation of the ale tasters, officials appointed to ensure that measures were honest and prices fair. The income was small, but in a household where every penny mattered, it was not negligible. Ale was one of the few goods a peasant woman could produce, control, and profit from, and the village alehouses, often just a corner of someone's home with a bush hung outside to signal fresh brew, were among the few spaces where social life unfolded apart from the fields and the church. Hunger was not an occasional visitor but a recurring presence. The grain stored in sacks and baskets had to last from one harvest to the next, a span of nearly 12 months. By late winter, supplies ran low. The period from February to June before the first new crops could be harvested was known across rural Europe as the hungry time. Families ate less. Meals became thinner, more watery, stretched further with whatever could be foraged from the woods or the margins of the fields. Wild greens, nettles, and the inner bark of trees appeared in the pot. Children were sent to glean the fields after the harvest, collecting every stray grain. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant hunger, and hunger, when it deepened, meant death. Seasonal hunger was expected, almost rhythmic. It was the price paid for survival in a world where storage was imperfect, yields were unpredictable, and the gap between abundance and famine was never more than one bad season. That gap closed completely in the years 1315 and 1316. A sequence of cold, wet summers across northern Europe caused widespread crop failure. The grain rotted in the fields before it could ripen. Hay could not be dried. Livestock starved or were slaughtered early, flooding the market with meat that could not be preserved and driving prices down even as bread became unaffordable. By the spring of 1316, people were eating anything that could be chewed: weeds, bark, seeds meant for planting, animals that would have been kept for breeding. The manor court rolls from these years' record sales of land at desperate prices, families fleeing their holdings, and mortality rates that spiked across every recorded estate. Some regions lost 10% of their population. In the villages hit hardest, it was more. The famine broke the assumption, fragile as it was, that hard work and careful management could keep a family alive. It revealed the truth that peasants already knew but could not afford to dwell on: survival was never guaranteed, and the systems that organized their labor were not designed to protect them when those systems failed. When the rains finally stopped and the harvest returned, the memory of those years did not fade. Grain prices remained volatile. Trust in the old rhythms weakened. Families who had lost members to starvation found themselves unable to work their holdings as they once had. The famine of 1315 did not end the world, but it cracked something in the structure of rural life. and that crack would widen in the decades to come. The food that sustained the peasant family was prepared and consumed in a dwelling that offered little comfort and less privacy. The dwelling that sheltered a peasant family in 13th century England was not designed for comfort or privacy. It was a container for work, storage, sleep, and survival, built from materials gathered within a few miles of where it stood. The typical peasant house measured no more than 15 feet wide and 30 feet long, a single rectangular space framed in timber, walled with woven branches and mud, and roofed with bundles of straw or reeds. It stood on land held by customary tenure, and like the family inside it, the structure itself belonged to a system of obligations that stretched far beyond its walls. The house was temporary, in a way modern buildings are not. It required constant upkeep, and it could be dismantled, rebuilt, or abandoned when the soil gave out or the lord redistributed holdings. What mattered was not the building, but the right to occupy it, and that right was never entirely secure. The frame rose first, cut from oak or ash, harvested from the lord's woodland under strict regulation. Timber was expensive and closely monitored, so peasant builders worked with what they could gather legally or afford to purchase. Posts were set into shallow holes or placed on flat stones to keep the wood from rotting in the damp earth. Horizontal beams connected the uprights, and lighter timbers formed the roof structure. The walls themselves were not made of solid planks, but of wattle, a lattice of hazel or willow rods woven between vertical stakes. Both sides of the wattle were then daubed with a thick mixture of clay, straw, dung, and water, smoothed by hand and left to dry. The result was a wall that kept out wind and rain, but not cold, not damp, and certainly not the persistent intrusion of insects and rodents. The daub cracked in dry summers and softened in wet winters, requiring annual repair. A house left untended for a single season could begin to sag and leak, its walls eroding back into the mud from which they had been formed. The roof was thatched with straw, reeds, or heather, depending on what grew nearby. Thatching was skilled work, done by specialists or by the householder with help from neighbors. Bundles were tied to the roof timbers in overlapping rows, creating a sloped surface that shed water when properly maintained. A well-thatched roof could last 20 years, but only if rethatched in patches each autumn and kept clear of moss and nesting birds. The pitch was steep to encourage runoff, and the eaves extended slightly to protect the walls below. There was no chimney. Smoke from the central hearth rose into the roof space and escaped through gaps in the thatch or through a simple hole left open near the peak. The interior was perpetually hazy, the timbers blackened and shiny with soot. The smoke had the unintended benefit of deterring insects and preserving the thatch, but it also irritated eyes and lungs, and respiratory ailments were common among those who spent their lives breathing it. The floor was packed earth, sometimes mixed with lime or dung to harden the surface. Rushes or straw were scattered over it to absorb moisture and provide a small measure of insulation, though these coverings quickly became filthy and had to be swept out and replaced. In wealthier peasant households, the floor might be covered with woven reed mats, but this was a luxury most could not afford. The earth was uneven, damp in wet seasons and dusty in dry ones. It smelled of smoke, stored grain, animal bedding, and human habitation. There was no separation between living space and working space, no distinction between where food was prepared and where tools were kept. The house functioned as workshop, stable, storehouse, and sleeping quarters all at once. The single room contained everything the family owned. A trestle table and benches occupied the center or one side of the space, assembled from rough planks, and easily moved or disassembled when the floor needed sweeping or when threshing was done indoors during bad weather. A few wooden chests held clothing, linens, and valuables such as a pewter cup or a spare knife. Shelves or pegs along the walls supported tools, bundles of dried herbs, coils of rope, and the implements of daily labor. Grain was stored in sacks or wooden bins, always vulnerable to moisture, mold, and rats. A spinning wheel or hand spindle leaned in a corner. Agricultural tools, a scythe or pitchfork, rested against the wall near the door. In winter, a cow or a pig might be brought inside at night to protect it from cold and theft, adding warmth to the room, but also noise, smell, and the need to shovel out manure each morning. The line between household and barnyard was thin and frequently crossed. The hearth was the heart of the house, an open fire built directly on the earthen floor or within a shallow pit lined with stones. There was no grate, no iron stove, no controlled flame. The fire was fed with wood, peat, or dried dung, and it burned low and smoky unless carefully tended. Cooking was done over this fire in iron or clay pots suspended from a tripod or set directly on the coals. Bread was baked in a communal oven in the village or on a flat stone at the edge of the hearth. The fire provided the only source of heat and light after dark, and keeping it alive through the night was a matter of survival in winter. Embers were banked under ash each evening and coaxed back to flame each morning. A household that let its fire go out faced the labor of rekindling it with flint and tinder, or the humiliation of borrowing coals from a neighbor. Sleeping arrangements were makeshift and communal. The family slept on straw-filled sacks, laid on the floor, or on low wooden platforms built against the walls. Wool blankets or sheepskins provided warmth, though these were expensive and often shared. Parents and children slept in the same room within sight and sound of one another. Privacy was not a concept that applied to peasant domestic life. Illness, childbirth, death, and the ordinary intimacies of marriage all took place in this single shared space. Servants or laborers hired for harvest might sleep on the floor near the door. In cold months, the presence of animals added body heat, though it also added fleas, lice, and the constant rustle and grunt of livestock adjusting in the dark. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. There was no plumbing, no latrine, no running water. A wooden bucket served as a chamber pot, emptied each morning into a midden heap behind the house or onto the garden plot. Waste from animals and humans alike accumulated in the yard, attracting flies in summer and freezing into ruts in winter. Bathing was infrequent, limited to washing hands and face in cold water drawn from a well or stream. Soap was a luxury made from animal fat and lye, used sparingly if at all. Clothing was worn for weeks without washing, and lice were a constant companion. Fleas lived in the straw bedding, in the rushes on the floor, and in the seams of wool garments. Rats nested in the thatch and in the grain stores, bold enough to move openly across the floor at night. The smell of smoke, sweat, dung, and damp wool was the smell of home, unremarkable to those who lived with it, but overwhelming to any visitor from outside the village. Maintenance of the house was endless and exhausting. The thatch needed patching after every storm. The daub walls had to be replastered each spring. The door, made of planks held together with wooden pegs and leather hinges, sagged and had to be rehung. The smoke hole in the roof had to be cleared of soot and debris. The floor had to be swept, the rushes replaced, the hearthstones reset when they cracked from heat. A house was not a finished object, but a continuous project, demanding labor and materials that competed with the labor and materials needed for farming. A widow or an aging couple without children might see their house slowly deteriorate, unable to keep up with the work required to hold it together. A house abandoned for even a single season could collapse into a heap of rotting wood and crumbling mud within a few years. The peasant house offered shelter from rain and cold, but it offered little else. It was dark, smoky, crowded, and uncomfortable. It was shared with animals and infested with vermin. It required constant attention to remain habitable, yet it was also the center of domestic production, the place where bread was baked and ale was brewed, where wool was spun and cloth was woven, where children were born and the dying were tended. It was the space where the family gathered at the end of the day, exhausted and hungry, to eat a meal and sleep in the warmth of the fire. It was not much, but it was theirs, insofar as anything could be said to belong to people who held their land by custom and lived at the sufferance of a lord they served but did not choose. The house was not a refuge from the world, but a working space embedded in a village where every action was observed and judged by neighbors. The house was not a refuge from the world, but a working space embedded in a village where every action was observed and judged by neighbors. A peasant household in 13th century England existed not in isolation, but as a single thread in a fabric woven from obligation, memory, and mutual dependence. The village was a face-to-face society in the most literal sense. Every dispute over a boundary stone, every unpaid debt, every insult shouted in anger became part of a shared record that no one could escape. Reputation was currency. A man known to shirk his labor services would find no one willing to lend him a plow team when his own ox went lame. A woman accused of watering her ale would lose customers and face the manor court within a fortnight. Trust and cooperation were not virtues in the abstract, but practical necessities in a world where survival depended on access to resources. No single household could control alone. Communal agriculture demanded coordination that could not be managed by goodwill alone. The open field system required every tenant to plant and harvest in rhythm with his neighbors. When one man's sheep broke through a fence and trampled another man's strips of barley, the damage affected not just the two families but the entire village's harvest calculations. Common grazing rights on the stubble after harvest meant that each household had to remove its crops on schedule or risk losing them to the collective herd. Gleaning, the practice of gathering leftover grain after the reapers had passed, was regulated by custom. Women and children moved through the fields in an order determined by need and status. Widows and the elderly went first, followed by families with many mouths to feed. The Lord's officials kept watch to ensure no one began too early or took more than the agreed handful per pass. It was charity embedded in enforcement, generosity bounded by suspicion. The woods and wastes, those marginal lands beyond the arable fields, were managed collectively under systems so intricate that they generated endless litigation. Every household held rights to gather deadwood for fuel, but cutting green timber required permission and often payment. Pigs could be driven into the forest to forage for acorns in autumn, but each village had a defined season and a limit on the number of animals. The manorial officer known as the woodward patrolled the boundaries and reported violations. A peasant caught felling an oak without license faced a fine and the loss of his wood. The tension was structural. The forest was both commons and property, a resource shared by custom but owned by the lord, and the line between legitimate use and theft was drawn and redrawn in the manor court with every case. The manor court met every 3 weeks in a hall or sometimes outdoors under a tree, and it was the arena where the social order was performed, contested and enforced. The steward or bailiff presided, but the jury was drawn from the tenants themselves. 12 men, usually the more prosperous villagers, swore to present all offences and answer all questions put to them. The court handled matters too small for the royal courts and too immediate for abstract principle. A man accused his neighbour of moving a boundary marker 2 feet into his strip. Another complained that a tenant had failed to scour his portion of the village ditch, causing water to flood onto adjacent land. A widow sought permission to inherit her late husband's holdings, paying a fine for the privilege. The rolls record these disputes in terse Latin, but behind each entry lay weeks of simmering resentment, whispered accusations, and the weighing of whether the cost of bringing a case outweighed the cost of enduring the injury. Debt cases filled the court rolls with numbing frequency. Peasants lent grain, tools, and cash to one another because there was no alternative. A bad harvest left families scrambling to borrow seed for the next planting. The loans were small, a few pence or a bushel of barley, but they carried weight in a world where a single missed payment could mean the difference between surviving the winter and losing everything. The court enforced repayment with fines, distraint of goods, or in extreme cases seizure of land. The same neighbour who lent you a scythe in June might summon you to court in October. Personal relationships and economic transactions were inseparable, and the resulting tensions ran through every household and every harvest. Trespass and theft were prosecuted with an attention to detail that suggests how little margin for loss existed. A man was fined for allowing his cow to graze in the Lord's meadow. Another faced court for taking a bundle of straw from a neighbour's yard. The theft of a single chicken might generate testimony from 6 witnesses. The court did not distinguish sharply between crime and nuisance. Both disrupted the fragile equilibrium of resources and expectations. Punishment was usually a fine calibrated to the offence and the offender's ability to pay, though repeat offenders might be placed in the stocks or expelled from the village entirely. The court was theatre as much as tribunal, a place where hierarchy was affirmed and the boundaries of acceptable behavior were publicly tested and redrawn. Personal insult, slander, and defamation occupied a surprising portion of the court's business. Words carried consequences in a society where reputation determined access to credit, marriage prospects, and communal goodwill. A man who called his neighbor a thief in the presence of others faced a lawsuit for damages. A woman accused of calling another a whore could expect to answer in court and pay a fine if the accusation was proven false. The rolls preserve fragments of these verbal battles, moments when anger overcame caution and insults were hurled in the field or at the alehouse door. The court did not typically investigate whether the slander was true. What mattered was that it had been spoken publicly, and public speech created public harm that required public remedy. Frank Pledge, a system of mutual responsibility that bound every male over the age of 12 into groups called tithings, extended the reach of communal surveillance into the household itself. Each tithing, usually 10 men, was collectively responsible for the good behavior of its members. If one man committed a crime and fled, the others paid his fine. The system presumed that neighbors would police one another out of self-interest, and the twice-yearly view of Frank Pledge brought every tithing before the court to confirm its membership and present any wrongdoing. It was governance by enforced proximity, a recognition that, in a world without professional law enforcement, order depended on making every man his brother's keeper whether he wished to be or not. Gossip was the informal counterpart to the court's formal authority. Information traveled through the village with a speed that official records could never match. A woman seen leaving a man's house at an unusual hour became the subject of speculation within the day. A family that suddenly acquired new clothing or tools faced questions about where the money had come from. The line between concern and cruelty was thin. Gossip reinforced norms, but it also destroyed lives. A reputation once damaged was nearly impossible to repair in a community where memory was long and forgiveness rare. Social pressure operated through exclusion. A family judged to have violated custom might find itself shut out of the alehouse, denied help at harvest, or quietly frozen out of the networks of exchange that made survival possible. The village was a system of interlocking dependencies, and the withdrawal of cooperation was a punishment more severe than any fine. The irony was that the same structures that enabled cooperation also generated the conflicts they were meant to resolve. The manor court existed because communal life produced endless friction. Frank Pledge bound men together in mutual suspicion as much as mutual aid. The village was not a harmonious whole, but a collection of households competing for limited resources under rules that could be interpreted, bent and contested at every turn. The peasant lived in a world where help and hostility came from the same sources, where the neighbor who lent you seed in spring might drag you to court in autumn, and where survival required managing a web of obligations, resentments, and alliances that shifted with every season. It was a society held together by necessity, not affection, and the bonds were as much chains as supports. Beyond the manor court and the lord's authority, another power shaped peasant life with equal force: the church. The parish church stood at the centre of the village, often the only building made of stone in a landscape of timber and thatch. Its tower rose above the fields, visible for miles, a landmark and a reminder. Inside, the walls were thick and cool, the air heavy with incense and the faint smell of candle wax. The floor was packed earth or stone flags worn smooth by centuries of feet. The nave stretched toward the chancel, where the altar stood draped in linen, and above it hung the rood, the carved figure of Christ on the cross flanked by Mary and John. This was the space where the entire village gathered, where baptisms and marriages and funerals were conducted, where the rhythm of the Christian year was enacted in ritual and song. The church was not merely a place of worship, it was the center of communal identity, the only institution that touched every life from birth to death. Attendance at Sunday Mass was not optional. Canon law required it, and the manor court enforced it. A peasant who failed to appear without good reason could be fined or publicly shamed. The service was conducted in Latin, a language few understood, spoken by a priest whose back was often turned to the congregation as he performed the rites at the altar. The peasant stood throughout, There were no pews in most parish churches until much later, and they watched and listened as best they could. The Mass followed a structure unchanged for centuries: the Kyrie, the Gloria, the reading of the Gospel, the consecration of the bread and wine, the elevation of the host. At that moment, when the priest lifted the wafer high, the congregation knelt. They believed they were witnessing a miracle, the transformation of bread into the body of Christ. For many, this was the most important moment of the week, the closest they would come to the divine. The liturgical calendar governed the passage of time with more authority than any secular system. The year began, not in January but at Advent, 4 weeks before Christmas. Each season had its character, its prescribed prayers and readings, its fasts and feasts. Lent imposed 40 days of abstinence from meat, eggs, and dairy, a hardship in late winter when food stores were already low. Easter brought relief and celebration, marked by the blessing of fire and water, the singing of the Alleluia, and the distribution of communion to the laity, one of the few times in the year they received it. Pentecost came 50 days later, and then the long stretch of ordinary time, punctuated by saints' days that broke the monotony of labor. Each saint had a feast, some modest, others grand, and the calendar was crowded with them. The Nativity of John the Baptist in late June, the Assumption of the Virgin in August, Michaelmas at the end of September, All Saints and All Souls in early November. These were not mere commemorations, they were holidays in the original sense, holy days when work was forbidden and the village gathered at the church. The priest who presided over these rituals occupied a strange position. He was set apart by his ordination, empowered to perform the sacraments that no layperson could administer. Yet he lived among his parishioners and depended on them for his support. Many rural priests were barely literate, able to recite the Latin of the Mass by rote but incapable of reading scripture with comprehension. They were often the sons of peasants themselves, chosen by the lord or the bishop, and given a few months of training before being assigned to a parish. Their income came from tithes, the mandatory payment of 1/10 of all produce, and from fees charged for baptisms, marriages, and burials. A priest might also hold a small plot of glebe land, which he farmed himself or hired others to work. He was expected to remain celibate, though many kept concubines, a practice the church condemned but rarely punished with severity. His role extended beyond the spiritual. He was often the only person in the village who could write, and he served as scribe for wills, contracts, and letters. He mediated disputes, offered counsel, and enforced moral order, reporting sins and transgressions to the manor court or the archdeacon's visitation. The payment of tithes was a source of constant tension. In theory, the tithe was simple: 1/10 of grain, 1/10 of livestock, 1/10 of wool, 1/10 of everything the land produced. In practice, it was a system ripe for evasion and dispute. Peasants hid grain, underreported yields, and argued over what counted as titheable produce. Did the tithe apply to the garden behind the house, to eggs and honey, to the increase of pigs? The church said yes. The peasants said no, or paid reluctantly, or delayed until the priest or his collector appeared at the door. Some tithes went directly to the parish priest, others to the rector, who might be a distant monastery, or a nobleman who held the benefice and paid a vicar to do the actual work. The system was inefficient and resented, but it was universal, and it funded not only the priest but the upkeep of the church itself, the repair of the roof, the purchase of candles and vestments and communion wine. Popular belief extended far beyond the formal doctrines taught by the church. The peasant understood Christianity through a lens shaped by older traditions, local saints, and the material culture of relics and pilgrimage. Every parish had its patron saint, often a figure of regional rather than universal significance, whose feast day was celebrated with processions, special masses, and communal feasting. Relics were objects of intense devotion: a sliver of bone, a scrap of cloth, a vial of water from a holy well. These were believed to possess miraculous power. They could heal the sick, protect crops, ensure a safe birth, or avert disaster. The church encouraged some of this devotion and suppressed other aspects, particularly when it verged too close to magic or superstition. Processions wound through the fields at Rogation Tide, asking God's blessing on the crops. Holy water was sprinkled on livestock to ward off disease. Candles were lit before images of the Virgin or the local saint, and prayers were offered in exchange for intercession. The line between Christian ritual and older custom was often blurred. Midsummer fires, harvest blessings, and the decoration of wells with flowers had roots that predated the church, but the church absorbed them, sanctified them, and made them part of the liturgical year. The church building itself was a theatre of images and symbols designed to instruct and inspire. The walls were painted with scenes from Scripture, the Last Judgment above the chancel arch, with Christ enthroned and the souls of the saved rising to heaven on the left, while the damned were dragged to hell on the right. The paintings were vivid and literal, meant to be read by those who could not read text. Saints stood in niches, their attributes clear: Catherine with her wheel, Margaret emerging from the dragon, Christopher carrying the Christ child across the river. Stained glass, where it existed, filtered the light into pools of colour, and the windows told stories in images that even a child could follow. The church smelled of smoke and incense, of damp stone and old wood. It was cold in winter, draughty and dark, lit only by the candles on the altar and the narrow windows high in the walls. It was a place of awe, designed to humble and elevate at once. Confession was compulsory at least once a year, usually before Easter. The peasant knelt before the priest and recited his sins: anger, theft, lust, failure to observe the Sabbath, failure to pay tithes. The priest asked questions, probed, assigned penance. The penance might be prayers, fasting, or a fine paid to the church. Serious sins, heresy, apostasy, sacrilege, were referred to the bishop's court. The threat of excommunication hung over those who refused to comply, a punishment that excluded the offender from the sacraments and from the community of the faithful. It was a social death as much as a spiritual one, and few risked it. The church's power was not abstract. It was enforced through ritual, through law, and through the everyday presence of the priest, who knew every family, every secret, every failure. Yet for all its authority, the church also offered comfort. It promised salvation, a life beyond the suffering of the present. It gave structure to time, meaning to hardship, and hope that the injustices of the world would be corrected in the next. The peasant who laboured in the field 6 days a week found rest on the seventh, not in idleness, but in the shared ritual of the Mass, the procession, the feast day meal. The church was the one institution that spoke of mercy, of forgiveness, of a God who cared for the poor and the lowly. Whether the peasant believed this fully or partially or pragmatically is impossible to know, but the church was inescapable, and its rituals marked every stage of life. The church offered structure and meaning, but it could not shield the peasant from illness, injury, and the omnipresent threat of early death. The body could survive astonishing hardship, and then fail suddenly from causes that left no visible mark. A man might work through a fever for days, cutting hay in July heat, only to collapse in the field and die before sunset. A child might wake with a cough and be dead within a week. A woman might survive a dozen harvests and then bleed to death in childbirth, her strength no protection against the tearing of tissue or the fever that followed. The medieval countryside was not a place where health could be taken for granted. It was a landscape of constant low-level illness, punctuated by acute crises that killed swiftly and without mercy. Dysentery was so common that it barely warranted mention in most records unless it killed someone important. The condition swept through villages in late summer, when water sources ran low and human and animal waste contaminated wells and streams. It began with cramps and loose bowels, progressed to bloody flux, and in severe cases led to dehydration and death within days. Children and the elderly were most vulnerable, though a strong adult could be brought down if the infection took hold during a period of hunger or exhaustion. There was no cure. Rest if one could afford to stop working, and boiled barley water were the standard responses. Most people simply endured it, working through the cramps until the illness passed or until it did not. Fevers arrived without warning and were understood in terms that bore little relation to their actual causes. A quartan fever returned every 4th day, a tertian every 3rd. Both were likely malaria, carried by mosquitoes that bred in marshes and drainage ditches throughout the lowlands of England and France. Villagers had no understanding of transmission by insect. They attributed fevers to bad air, to imbalances in the humors, or to divine punishment. Treatment involved bloodletting, herbal infusions, and prayer. Willow bark tea, which contained a compound similar to aspirin, provided some relief from pain and inflammation. Feverfew, as the name suggested, was steeped for headaches and chills. Neither addressed the underlying infection, but both reduced suffering enough to allow continued labor. Respiratory infections killed more people in winter than any other season. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was endemic. It spread easily in crowded, poorly ventilated houses where smoke from the hearth irritated lungs already weakened by years of inhaling chaff and dust during threshing. The disease progressed slowly, marked by a persistent cough, weight loss, night sweats, and eventually the coughing up of blood. There was no treatment. Some lingered for years, growing thinner and weaker until they could no longer work. Others died within months. Pneumonia struck more suddenly, often following a cold or influenza. A deep cough, high fever, and labored breathing signaled the onset. If the patient survived 3 days, they might recover. If not, they drowned in the fluid filling their lungs. Malnutrition did not always look like starvation. It appeared as lethargy, as wounds that would not heal, as gums that bled and teeth that loosened. A diet based almost entirely on grain and ale provided calories, but lacked sufficient protein, vitamins, and minerals, especially in winter and early spring when stored vegetables ran out and fresh greens had not yet appeared. Anemia was widespread, particularly among women of childbearing age, who lost blood monthly and rarely consumed enough iron-rich food to compensate. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was less common in rural areas than among sailors, because peasants had access to cabbages, leeks, and wild herbs during much of the year. Still, by March or April, after months without fresh produce, the signs appeared: swollen joints, weakness, wounds that reopened without cause. Agricultural labor produced a steady stream of injuries that ranged from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. A slip of the scythe during harvest could sever tendons in the hand or foot. Axes used for splitting wood or felling trees were heavy and difficult to control when wielded by someone weakened by hunger or fatigue. Broken bones were common, caused by falls from carts, kicks from oxen, or the collapse of poorly built structures. A fracture of the arm or leg might heal if the bone was set properly and the limb immobilized, but infection was always a risk. An open wound, especially one contaminated by soil or manure, often turned septic. The flesh around the injury swelled, darkened, and began to rot. If the infection spread into the bloodstream, death followed within days. Hernias were an occupational hazard for men who spent their lives lifting, carrying, and pulling. The condition occurred when part of the intestine pushed through a weakness in the abdominal wall, creating a bulge that grew larger over time. It caused chronic pain and made physical labor difficult, but there was no surgical repair available to a peasant. A truss, a pad held in place by a belt, provided some support but did not cure the problem. If the hernia became strangulated, cutting off blood flow to the trapped tissue, the result was agonizing pain, vomiting, and death, unless the blockage resolved on its own. Most men simply worked through the discomfort until they could no longer do so. Childbirth was the great leveler among women. Wealth might provide better food and a cleaner birthing environment, but it offered little protection against the fundamental dangers of labor. A first birth was the most dangerous, as the woman's body had not yet stretched to accommodate passage of the child. Prolonged labor could last 2 or 3 days, exhausting the mother and increasing the risk of infection or hemorrhage. Midwives attended most births, their knowledge passed down orally and rooted in experience rather than formal training. They knew how to reposition a baby that presented poorly, how to deliver the placenta, and how to stanch bleeding with pressure and herbal preparations. What they could not do was operate, transfuse blood, or treat infection with anything more effective than prayers and poultices. If a woman survived labor, she still faced weeks of vulnerability to puerperal fever, an infection of the uterus caused by bacteria introduced during delivery. The condition began with chills and a rising fever, followed by delirium and death within days. No one understood that unwashed hands and contaminated instruments were the primary vectors. The midwife who delivered one woman might carry infection to the next without realizing it. Infant mortality was equally grim. Roughly 1 in 3 children died before their first birthday, victims of respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, or simple failure to thrive in an environment that offered little margin for error. Folk remedies filled the gap left by the absence of trained physicians, who served the nobility and urban wealthy, but rarely appeared in rural villages. Herbalism was not superstition but practical knowledge accumulated over generations. Chamomile was used to calm the stomach and ease sleep. Comfrey, applied as a poultice, helped knit broken bones and reduce inflammation. Garlic, consumed raw or cooked, had genuine antimicrobial properties, though no one understood why it worked. St. John's wort was taken for wounds and low spirits. Not all remedies were effective, and some were harmful. Lead-based compounds were used for skin conditions despite their toxicity. Mercury was applied to syphilitic sores, poisoning the patient slowly. Barber surgeons traveled between towns and occasionally visited larger villages, offering services that included tooth extraction, bloodletting, and the lancing of boils. They had no formal medical training and learned their trade through apprenticeship. Their tools were crude: iron pincers, fleams for bloodletting, cautery irons heated in an open flame. Surgery in the modern sense was almost non-existent. Amputations were performed in cases of gangrene, but the patient often died from shock or infection. Trepanation, the drilling of a hole in the skull to relieve pressure, was attempted for severe head injuries, though survival was rare. For most ailments, the barber surgeon had little to offer beyond confidence and the appearance of expertise. When illness progressed beyond the reach of any intervention, attention turned to the soul. A dying person was expected to confess their sins to the parish priest, receive absolution, and take communion one final time. This ritual preparation for death was as important as any medical treatment, perhaps more so in a culture that believed the afterlife began immediately upon the body's final breath. The family gathered, often in the same room where the person had lived and worked, and kept vigil as death approached. The body was washed, wrapped in a shroud, and carried to the churchyard for burial. A grave was dug in consecrated ground, marked with a wooden cross, or, for those with resources, a stone. Prayers were said for the soul, which was believed to face judgment before God. Masses might be commissioned for weeks or years afterward, purchased by family members or funded by bequests left in the will. The rituals surrounding death served both spiritual and social functions. They affirmed the deceased person's place within the Christian community and provided structure for grief. They also reinforced the Church's authority over the most significant transitions of human life. To die without confession was to risk damnation, a fear that ensured compliance with ecclesiastical demands. Yet the reality was often messier than doctrine allowed. People died suddenly in fields, in fires, in accidents that left no time for a priest. Infants died unbaptized. Suicides were buried outside the churchyard, in unhallowed ground, their souls condemned. The Church offered hope of salvation, but also wielded the threat of exclusion, a power that extended even beyond the grave. Even as individual lives were precarious, the collective rhythms of the village endured, punctuated by rare moments of rest, festivity, and shared joy. The peasant year was not an unbroken sequence of toil. Even in a world governed by obligation and scarcity, there existed intervals when labour ceased, when ale flowed more freely than usual, and when the village gathered not to plough or reap, but to celebrate. These moments were rare, carefully bounded by the liturgical calendar and the demands of survival, but they were vital. Without them, the social fabric of the village would have frayed under the weight of exhaustion and resentment. Festivity was not leisure in any modern sense. It was regulated, communal, and always shadowed by the knowledge that the work would resume. The Church provided the framework for most of these breaks. Feast days honoring Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints punctuated the year with enforced rest. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the feasts of major saints such as John the Baptist and Michael the Archangel were days when labour in the fields was forbidden. The prohibition was not merely customary but canonical, enforced by the threat of sin and the scrutiny of neighbours. On these days the peasant was expected to attend Mass, often more than once, and to refrain from servile work. The definition of servile work was broad enough to include ploughing, mowing, and threshing, though it allowed for the care of animals and the preparation of food. In practice, this meant that the household could rest without starving, but it could not advance the work of the agricultural year. The number of such days varied by region and diocese, but in 13th century England, a peasant might expect somewhere between 30 and 50 holy days each year, when field labour was prohibited. This was not a small concession. Combined with Sundays, it meant that roughly 1 day in 4 was, in theory, free from the heaviest obligations. The reality was more complicated. Holy days often fell during slack periods in the agricultural calendar, when there was little work to be done in any case. Conversely, a feast day that arrived during harvest could create genuine tension between the need to bring in the grain and the expectation of pious observance. Manorial records occasionally note fines levied against those who worked on forbidden days, a reminder that the boundary between sacred time and productive time was policed, if imperfectly. What filled these days of rest depended on the season and the occasion. Christmas brought several days of enforced idleness, during which the cold and the short daylight hours made outdoor labour undesirable, in any case. The household might slaughter a pig if one had been fattened through the autumn, and the resulting pork, fresh rather than salted, was a rare indulgence. Ale brewed for the occasion circulated among kin and neighbours. The parish church was decorated with holly and ivy, and the Mass was sung with particular solemnity. There was gift-giving, though on a modest scale: a loaf of bread, a measure of grain, a wooden toy for a child. The lord of the manor sometimes provided a feast for his tenants, an act of largesse that reinforced hierarchy, even as it offered temporary abundance. The food was better than usual, the fire larger, the evening longer. Then it ended, and January arrived with its hunger and its mud. Easter was the other great pole of the festive year. It followed the long deprivation of Lent, during which meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden to all who could afford to observe the fast. The Paschal Feast broke this prohibition with eggs, cheese, and the flesh of spring lambs. The celebration was as much about survival as salvation. By late March or early April, the stored grain of the previous harvest was running low, and the new crops were weeks away from ripening. The feast marked not only the resurrection of Christ, but also the hope that the household would endure until summer. The church ale brewed for Easter was stronger and more plentiful than usual, and the churchyard became a gathering place where disputes were set aside, at least temporarily, and where the village reasserted its coherence. Church ales were a distinctive feature of English rural life, and they occupied a space between festivity and obligation. These were fundraising events organised by the parish to pay for the maintenance of the church building, the purchase of vestments, or the support of the priest. The church wardens announced the date, and households were expected to contribute malt, grain, or labour. On the appointed day, ale was brewed in large quantities, often in a dedicated church house or in the nave itself. Tables were set up, and the ale was sold to villagers at a modest price. The proceeds went to the church, but the event itself was as much social as sacred. People drank, ate bread and cheese if they could afford it, and lingered in conversation. Music was played, sometimes on simple instruments such as pipes or drums, and there was dancing, though the church hierarchy looked on such behaviour with suspicion. Bride ales followed a similar logic but served a different purpose. When a couple married, their families and friends gathered to drink ale that had been brewed specially for the occasion. Guests paid for the ale, and the money raised helped the newlyweds establish their household. It was a form of mutual aid dressed in the guise of celebration, and it revealed the extent to which survival in the medieval village depended on the willingness of neighbours to contribute to one another's crucial transitions. The ale flowed, the guests grew loud, and the bride and groom received not only money, but also the public acknowledgement of their new status within the community. The church tolerated these events, though it worried about the drunkenness and the songs, which were often bawdy and drew on traditions far older than Christianity. Harvest Home, the celebration that followed the completion of the grain harvest, was perhaps the most deeply felt of all the village festivals. It was not a holy day in the liturgical sense, but it marked a moment of collective accomplishment and relief. The last sheaf of wheat or barley was brought in with ceremony, sometimes dressed with ribbons or flowers, and the harvest workers gathered for a meal provided by the lord or by the wealthier peasants. There was bread made from the new grain, meat if the household could spare it, and ale in quantities that would have been unthinkable on an ordinary day. Songs were sung, some of them work songs repurposed for celebration, others older and harder to trace. The gathering was brief. The work of threshing and winnowing still lay ahead, and the autumn ploughing could not wait. But for a few hours the village allowed itself to acknowledge what had been achieved and to forget, momentarily, what might yet go wrong. Games and entertainments were simple and communal. Wrestling matches were common, and so were contests of strength such as lifting stones or throwing hammers. Foot races and ball games took place in the stubble fields after harvest or on the village green. These were not organized sports in any formal sense, but spontaneous eruptions of energy and competition, often accompanied by wagers of small sums or measures of ale. Children played with wooden tops, hoops, and dolls made of rags and straw. Adults told stories, though few of these were written down, and the content ranged from saints' lives to local gossip to tales of outlaws and tricksters. The line between entertainment and moral instruction was thin. A story might be funny and instructive at once, or it might be funny precisely because it mocked the pretensions of those in authority. Music was everywhere, though it left almost no written record. Peasants sang while they worked, while they drank, or while they walked from one place to another. The songs were passed down orally, and they changed with each generation and each village. Some were religious, hymns learned in church and sung in processions. Others were secular, bawdy, or satirical. Instruments were rare and simple: a pipe made from a hollow reed, a drum fashioned from a wooden frame and stretched hide, a fiddle carved from a single piece of wood. Professional musicians, minstrels, and jongleurs travelled from village to village and performed for small payments or meals. They brought news, songs, and stories from beyond the parish boundary, and their arrival was an event in itself. The church regarded much of this festivity with ambivalence. It endorsed the holy days and the processions, but it worried constantly about excess, about drunkenness, about dancing, and about the survival of pagan customs under a Christian veneer. Ecclesiastical legislation repeatedly condemned the mixing of sacred and profane, the holding of markets in churchyards, the performance of plays with elements of mockery or magic. Yet the church also depended on the village's participation in its festivals, and it could not suppress traditions without risking resentment. The result was a negotiated coexistence, in which the clergy complained and the laity ignored them, or complied just enough to avoid serious conflict. The roadier aspects of festivity persisted because they served functions the church could not fulfill. They released tension, they affirmed community, and they reminded people that life contained more than work and prayer. These moments of relief were fragile, and by the mid-14th century the entire structure of peasant life was about to be shattered by forces beyond anyone's control. The peasant household that survived the famine of 1315 emerged into a world that had revealed its cruelty with startling clarity. The harvest failures began in the spring of that year, when incessant rains drowned seedbeds across northern Europe and turned ploughed fields into quagmires. The summer brought no relief. Grain rotted in the ground, or emerged stunted and disease-ridden. By autumn, it was clear that the yield would fall catastrophically short of what was needed. The crisis deepened in 1316 when the rains returned and the harvest failed again. Manorial records from estates across England document the collapse. On the Bishop of Winchester's manors, wheat yields fell to less than half their normal levels. Livestock deaths soared as fodder ran out, and murrain swept through weakened herds. Prices for grain quadrupled in some markets, placing even coarse bread beyond the reach of labourers and cotters who depended on wages and the market rather than their own land. Starvation arrived not as a dramatic rupture, but as a grinding attrition. Families consumed seed grain that should have been saved for planting. They slaughtered draft animals they could not feed, ensuring that future ploughing would be even more difficult. They foraged in woods and commons for roots, bark, and anything remotely edible. Chroniclers recorded rumours of desperate acts, though how widespread such extremity became remains uncertain. What the records do show with cold precision is mortality. In the village of Hael-Sowen, deaths recorded in manorial court rolls more than doubled during the famine years. On some estates, tenant deaths reached 15% of the population. The poorest suffered most acutely. Smallholders with fewer than 10 acres had no surplus to fall back upon, and landless labourers had nothing but their wages, which bought less with each passing month. The famine burned itself out not because conditions improved dramatically, but because there were fewer mouths to feed, and because survivors had liquidated assets, borrowed against future harvests, and scraped through by means that left them poorer and more vulnerable than before. The generation that followed rebuilt slowly. Grain prices stabilized. Population growth resumed, though more cautiously than in the expansive 13th century. The manorial system continued to function. Labor services were still owed, courts still met, and tithes were still collected. Yet beneath the surface, the famine had exposed the fragility of a world operating at the limits of its productive capacity. The margin between survival and disaster had never been wide, and now it had been tested and found terrifyingly narrow. For 30 years, rural England and northern France existed in this precarious equilibrium, recovering but not thriving, sustained by customs and obligations that had governed life for generations. Then, in the summer of 1348, a new catastrophe arrived that made the famine look like a rehearsal. The pestilence that would come to be known as the Black Death reached the southern coast of England in June of 1348, carried on ships from the continent where it had already devastated ports and cities. By autumn it had spread inland, moving along roads and rivers, entering villages, manor houses, monasteries, and market towns with indiscriminate ferocity. The disease killed swiftly. Victims developed swellings in the groin, neck, or armpits, followed by fever, chills, vomiting, and often death within 3 to 5 days. No one understood contagion as a mechanism. Explanations ranged from divine punishment to corrupt air to the malign influence of planetary alignments. What mattered was that the dying came in numbers that overwhelmed every existing structure of care, burial, and record-keeping. Manorial court rolls, which had reliably documented deaths and land transfers for decades, began to show gaps, cancellations, and desperate marginal notes as clerks struggled to keep pace with the scale of loss. The mortality rate varied by region and by the density of settlement, but across rural England, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population died within 2 years. In some villages, the death toll reached 60%. Entire families were wiped out. Holdings passed through 2 or 3 heirs in a matter of months. The rhythm of agricultural labour, which had always depended on collective effort and the availability of hands at planting and harvest, collapsed. Fields went unploughed. Livestock wandered untended. The manor court at Hael-Sowen recorded that in 1349, more than half the customary tenants had died, and there were not enough survivors to fill the vacant holdings even when the lord offered them at reduced rents. The same pattern appeared on estates across the country. The Bishop of Winchester's lands, which had been meticulously managed and profitable for centuries, saw income plummet as labour vanished and rents went uncollected. The plague did not destroy the physical infrastructure of the manor, but it shattered the human relationships and obligations that had made the system function. The immediate aftermath brought confusion and opportunity in equal measure. Survivors found themselves in a world where labour had suddenly become scarce and valuable. Peasants who had spent their lives performing weak work and boon work for a lord discovered that their services were now in demand and that they could negotiate. Some simply left their home villages and sought employment elsewhere, a mobility that would have been unthinkable before the plague, when custom and legal status bound families to the manor for generations. Wages for agricultural labour doubled, then tripled in some regions. Lords scrambled to secure workers for harvest and ploughing, offering cash payments, better terms, and reduced obligations. The market for labour, which had always tilted overwhelmingly in favour of landowners, had inverted almost overnight. The response from those in authority was swift and severe. In 1351, the English crown enacted the Statute of Labourers, a sweeping attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and compel workers to accept employment at the rates that had prevailed before 1348. The statute also restricted movement, forbidding labourers from leaving their home parishes in search of higher pay. Enforcement fell to local officials, sheriffs and justices of the peace, who were tasked with prosecuting both workers who demanded excessive wages and employers who offered them. The ordinance was reissued and expanded multiple times over the following decades, a clear sign that it was not working as intended. Court records show thousands of prosecutions under the statute, but they also reveal widespread evasion, defiance, and negotiation. Peasants continued to move. Wages continued to rise, though more slowly and unevenly than they might have without legal suppression. The statute represented an attempt to restore a world that no longer existed, and while it caused hardship and resentment, it could not reverse the fundamental shift in the balance of power between lord and labourer. Over the decades that followed, the manorial system adapted but did not recover its former coherence. Labour services, which had been the backbone of Demesne agriculture, became increasingly difficult to enforce. Lords began to lease out Demesne lands rather than farm them directly, a process that had begun in some regions before the plague, but now accelerated dramatically. By the end of the 14th century, many manors had converted most or all labour obligations into cash rents, a shift that effectively transformed villeins into tenant farmers. This was not a sudden emancipation. Legal serfdom persisted, and lords retained significant authority over their tenants through the manor court, control of inheritance and the power to levy fines. But the nature of the relationship had changed. The peasant who paid rent in coin rather than in days of labour had more autonomy over their time, more ability to produce for the market, and more leverage to resist or negotiate unfavourable terms. The decline of labour services and the shift toward cash rents created new vulnerabilities, as well as new freedoms. Peasants became more dependent on market conditions, on the price of grain and livestock, and on access to buyers for surplus produce. Those with larger holdings and capital to invest could prosper in this environment, accumulating land from poorer neighbours and hiring wage labour to work it. A new differentiation emerged within peasant society, separating wealthier farmers who resembled small landowners from landless labourers who worked for wages and had little security. The village remained a site of cooperation and mutual obligation, but it also became more stratified, more competitive, and more integrated into regional and national economies. The manor court continued to meet, but its business shifted toward disputes over debt, contract, and property, rather than the enforcement of customary labour. The erosion of serfdom was neither swift nor uniform. In some regions, lords fought tenaciously to preserve traditional obligations, and legal serfdom did not formally disappear in England until the late 15th and early 16th centuries. In others, the transformation was nearly complete by 1400. What mattered was not the pace but the direction. The world the peasant inhabited in 1300, with its rigid hierarchies, collective agriculture, and binding customs, had given way to something more fluid, more uncertain, and more recognizably modern. The catastrophes of the 14th century had not liberated the peasant from exploitation or hardship, but they had broken the grip of a system that had seemed immovable. The world the plague left behind was not the world it entered, and the peasant who survived found themselves in a landscape where old certainties no longer held.